Oh, and welcome to the Talkback for Free Chol Soo Lee. My name is Amy Torres. I'm Executive Director with New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, and I'll be facilitating tonight's Talkback. I'm really proud to be joined by our guest speakers, directors of the film, Julie Ha and Eugene Lee. Free Chol Soo Lee is a film that tackles the deeply entrenched racisms of our criminal legal and court systems, the trauma of incarceration, the othering of Asian America, and inspiringly, the power of immigrant organizing. We know this film sits really heavily with people who have been targeted by our criminal legal system or by racial tokenizing and discrimination. So we ask that over the course of tonight's discussion that you be both caring and careful in your language, and that in your remarks you are both thoughtful and helpful as we engage in conversation together. So over the course of this evening, we'll be talking about the film and subjects ranging from, again, the racism of our carceral systems and our court systems, also Asian American and Pacific Islander identity, struggle, and acceptance, and finally, immigrant organizing and community power. So let's get into it. I'm so pleased to be joined by our directors, Julie Ha and Eugene Lee. If you've received the promotional reminders about tonight's talkback, you may have seen that we had a third speaker, Edgar Aquino-Huerta, who was the subject of the short on Cumberland County at the start of tonight's screening. Unfortunately, Edgar can't join us tonight, but we will be making sure to infuse New Jersey perspectives and experiences over the course of tonight's discussion. So first, I thought it might be helpful, Julie and Eugene, to talk a little bit about, for me, you know, as someone engaged in immigrant advocacy, there were a lot of parallels that I think we still hear today between immigrants in the time that Chol Soo Lee's case was happening and this like association with gang activity. You know, in the presidential race leading up to 2016, there was this line about immigrants being all bad, right? They're all rapists, they're all drug traffickers, and this automatic association with criminality. And Chol Soo Lee himself said, "I'm a Korean. This was a Chinese gang issue. Surely it would get cleaned up." Can you talk a little bit about how this sort of like othering and lumping together of immigrant experiences and this sort of flattening of immigrant identities contributed to the wrongful conviction in Chol Soo Lee's case? Do you want to go ahead, Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, we can start off with just a little bit of context for that moment in Chinatown. It was a time following the 1965 change in immigration laws when there were new immigrants coming into Chinatown, and Chris Chow, who was a reporter at the time on television, we spoke with him, and he grew up in Chinatown. He's a native, and the way he spoke about growing up there was of a neighborhood that did have a lot of violence, did have a lot of poverty, and was over-policed. You know, I mean, the line that he said that I think has stayed with me was just about how, you know, if you were, you know, Chinese and you had long hair, then you must be a gang member, because that's sort of what a gang member in Chinatown might have looked like at the time. And he spoke about harassment from the police on top of just all the other ills that were going on at the time. So, I mean, I think that kind of gives a sense of, you know, connection to the ways that, you know, enclaves, minority neighborhoods, over police spaces are talked about today as well, you know, and kind of connects the issues that relate to Chol Soo Lee to some of the concerns that you brought up today.
I think too, you know, it's important to mention just, you know, how our criminal justice system doesn't necessarily self-correct when something like this happens, when somebody is racially profiled or there is an error made by police. You know, you see in our film that it was actually the gun evidence and the ballistics that first pointed at Chol Soo Lee, and that's why the police made the arrest. And you see in our film, though, that that was later discovered to be an error, a ballistics error. So why didn't we self-correct at that point? You know, why did the prosecution of this man move forward? and him being sentenced to life. You see even in the trial, in that first murder trial, that, according to the court transcripts, Chol Soo Lee was identified by the arresting police officer on the stand as Chinese. And Chol Soo Lee's own defense attorney did not correct that, for the record, his own defense attorney. So I think you see so many issues with just, when you're this poor Korean immigrant, who was wrongly accused, how easily our criminal justice system can actually still convict you and destroy your life. And I think it's something that happens with so many people who are, of different communities, but you're not used to seeing this, I think, with an Asian American. And I think our film, that's why we thought this history was just so important for us to know.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Julie, in your response, you sort of teased out that this isn't just a story about criminal justice, but there's also an economic justice and an immigrant justice theme running throughout Chol Soo Lee's story. And in the very beginning, he talks about his experience taking on odd jobs, right? And taking part in petty theft to feed himself, working across the informal economy. Can you talk a little bit about, how is this part of a system that criminalizes poverty? What other resources would have been available to him if it weren't just a circumstance of being wrong place, wrong time, lack of access to quality representation or resources, even lack of access to things like language access?
Yes, I think, well, if he did have a competent criminal defense attorney who just actually showed them the facts of the case. I mean, the eyewitness descriptions, Chol Soo Lee didn't even meet the initial eyewitness descriptions that described a much taller man, somebody who was between 5'6" and 5'10". And Chol Soo Lee was clearly a shorter man, closer to 5'2", 5'3". And so just based on that alone, they should have dismissed him as a suspect. So I think you do see the role of poverty. And sometimes you wonder if it's that mentality of, well, he may not have committed this crime, but he'll probably commit another crime because look at his criminal record. And, we often point out that when Chol Soo Lee was arrested for this murder, it was a wrongful conviction, but at the same time, he was not, as he himself says, not an angel before that. He was sort of living a life on the streets, on the margins. He did commit some past crimes. He did have a criminal record. He did commit, theft in the past. And so he was not some kind of completely, innocent person in the eyes of, I think some, our members of our society. But at the same time, he did not commit this crime. He did not commit this murder. But I think you do, as you were saying, you do see how easily people who are in his type of situation, who are poor, an immigrant, he didn't have a support system, even a family support system that had come to his aid. His mom was actually not fluent in English and she was illiterate. She was, working around the clock just to support her family. And also there was, a contentious relationship even between him and his mother. And he did not actually have a community, of people who could come to his aid at the time. The Korean American community was not really, developed and rooted at that time that he was arrested. And it's interesting because when we spoke with Ranko Yamada, the activist in our film, who plays such a key role in coming to his aid, earlier than anyone, she actually told us, she said, the reason I got involved and tried so hard to help him was because I knew he didn't have that support system, the family, the community, who could come to his aid. And she knew something terrible could happen to him within our criminal justice system, and it did.
Yeah, I would love to hear more of your perspectives on these various failures of different systems. The film deals very directly with the failures of the criminal legal system, the court system, our carceral systems, but really Chol Soo Lee was a victim of like multiple forms of state violence, right? Stemming from his childhood, US involvement and intervention in the Korean War, displacement to the US, even having his parents separated from him in those early childhood years in Korea. And then once arriving in the US, the sort of like state sanctioned violence of the school system, where just not having access to an interpreter or translator resulted in him facing punishment in school and eventually having like forced medication when he was institutionalized for what the school thought were mental health issues. So really there's been so many intersections of state sanctioned violence against him that this period in his adult life is really just an additional chapter in that. Can you talk a little bit more about how immigrant communities, people of color, end up vulnerable to these sort of like pipelines that end up throwing people away?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. The phrase that's used is the school to prison pipeline. But I'm glad that you mentioned that it started so much earlier for Chol Soo. Like it was, he was a child of war and just experienced the dire poverty of having grown up during that time. I mean, we also like to point out that it was during this time in Korea that he grew up in just a very warm and loving household, and so there is like a complexity there that's personal, and I think is important to recognize. But once he came to the U.S., the inequities that you speak of, and to go back to what you mentioned before, the lack of language support, being lumped in with the Chinese children, even though that wasn't his heritage, being sort of at the psychiatric institute, and his lack of language really leading to just sort of this diagnosis that he received, and the forced medication. I mean, those are all part and parcel of the ways that the needs of minorities can get just sort of trampled upon by a system that doesn't have the cultural sensitivity to really be able to engage. And that's so much of what Chol Soo ran into. I also just want to mention the class aspect of things as well, because that was just such an important part of what Chol Soo's background was about, but also in the context of Asian America and in Asian American context, class is just something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, because there is this narrative surrounding the model minority myth of success in America, of sort of some of these concerns perhaps not affecting Asian Americans as much because of the socioeconomic success of certain sectors of our communities. But there's a vast class divide in Asian America that exists even to today. And the Chol Soo Lee story just sort of illustrates so much of what can go wrong if you are of the wrong class, if you are a minority. And as you mentioned, I mean, almost at every step of the way, there is an institution, there is a system that is not set up to be able to take care of what you need as an individual at the time.
We have a question from the audience. Someone asked, Chol Soo Lee was freed, but considering what happened, is this justice? Is there any recourse for a life that was ruined?
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. Chol Soo Lee, before he died, he wrote his memoirs, and it was called Freedom Without Justice. As you see in the film, even freedom proved elusive for him after he was physically released from prison. He had demons that chased him from that long-term unjust incarceration for 10 years. 4 of those years on death row. Several of those years actually were spent in solitary confinement. That's not in the film, but we do know that. And, it's been well documented now, the damage that kind of isolation does to a human being. And so he had so much to overcome, as well as the expectations of an entire community of people, who spent 6 years of their lives trying to free a stranger. He felt he owed this incredible debt. And also, how do you live up to that? How do you repay that? How do you live up to their expectations? When, he grew up with so many with so many obstacles to begin with, ever since birth, so he had so many scars that he was carrying, and what a heavy load then to become the symbol of a movement. And so I think, this film, this story, it's just, we do hope like people will, look not only at how our criminal justice system treats people, but I think also just trying to open their hearts to the experience of this person, Chol Soo Lee, who in a way experienced more pain and suffering than any human being should have to endure in a lifetime. And so hopefully people can see that despite all of it, he did keep trying, and he had an incredibly resilient spirit.
Wonderful. Thank you for the audience question. And we just want to remind folks that are following along that you can use the chat to ask questions and engage. Thank you for contributing that. As we move on, Julie and Eugene, to the next part of our conversation, there's two things that I want to name before we start talking about Asian American identity and struggle and acceptance. First is a quote from the journalist K.W. Lee, who first wrote about Chol Soo's story. He said, "There are an awful lot of unlucky people, especially Asians. They have no language and they cannot tell their own stories." And the film was released at a time when we're also reckoning with this rising tide of anti-Asian discrimination. There are huge campaigns to stop AAPI hate in the wake of, very racist and xenophobic ideas about the pandemic, but also these like economic anxieties and just like deeply entrenched fears that recall some of the worst yellow peril eras of our nation's past. And so I wanted to hear from you a little bit. We talked about this a little at the start, but I'd like to tease it out. Asian Americans hail from over 50 different nations. We speak over 100 different languages, countless ethnic groups, countless identities. And one of the contributing factors to the conviction were white eyewitnesses who, again, because of like deeply rooted ideas about Asian Americans, just felt that, well, all the suspects look the same, right? Can you say a little bit more about how does this flattening still persist today? I think it was a very central part of the film, but we're still reckoning with it today, where, people will tell members of my family and my community, the Filipino American community, go back to where you came from, right? Or you're responsible for this virus. And it's, there's these ideas that, all Asians come from the same place and share the same identity. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like, creating this film and also releasing the film in this era where we're having the same conversation with a fresh issue?
Yeah.
And I know this isn't an easy question, so I'm sorry to topic for many of us.
It's interesting. Before when we were just chatting before this conversation started, we'd mentioned, that we didn't plan to take 6 years to make this film. It took us 6 years to complete. And so we didn't purposely release it into this kind of environment, but we did notice as we've been, we've had the privilege of taking this film around for more than a year now. And it's just incredible the reaction that we're getting, especially from Asian American audiences, because I think there's such a deep hunger for humanizing portrayals of our lives and our experiences and our truth. And people are, my gosh, it just feels like we've been living in this terrible environment where our members of our own families are afraid to go out, and especially our parents' generation and afraid of being attacked just for being Asian. And we had, of course, a former president who perpetuated this horrible racism. And so I think, releasing the film into this environment, we do see like how much people are just, responding very strongly and powerfully to the story. We're not used to seeing this Asian American centered film where in the story the person is the victim of racial profiling. We're not used to seeing that there's this Korean immigrant journalist who comes in and he digs for the truth, and his stories help trigger this movement of people. We're not used to seeing, a group of Asian Americans, young and old, politically conservative and politically radical, like joining together and creating this movement, the likes of which I think this country has never seen before. That includes church-going grandmothers, at courthouse protests holding signs. So I think, we're hoping that people can connect the dots, though, between the racism that's happening now and what's happened to our community in the past. But it's oftentimes a very little acknowledged history. I think sometimes people do still buy into the model minority, or they think that the racism we experience are microaggressions, but we don't understand or know our own history, that it does include terrible acts of anti-Asian violence. It does include this kind of racial profiling and being railroaded in the criminal justice system. And, actually it does still happen today, but it's just, again, not acknowledged and not known. And yet we also hope that people could watch our film and then take inspiration, from the fact that Asian Americans, when they saw this injustice, they banded together and they stood up to one of the most powerful institutions in this country, the criminal justice system, and said, you did wrong and we're going to right this wrong. And this was, by the way, at a time when Asian Americans had very little political power. And yet somehow, they overturned 2 murder convictions to free this man from death row. That's almost something that I think a lot of lawyers would say was impossible, and yet they did it. And so I think sometimes in our environment, it gets easy to feel, I think, hopeless and helpless. And so I think we do hope that people can look at what happened, what people did more than 40 years ago, built such an unusual alliance and movement, and we're able to accomplish the impossible.
Yeah, I think if I could just add, and I'll just say that sharing this in TNEC is meaningful to me personally because I was a resident of the tri-state area until last year, and was in Bergen County in Palisades Park until last year. And so I remember the fear when some of these attacks started happening. I just remember just very vividly, just friends, just afraid to go about their lives. And so yes, as kind of Julie mentioned, I mean, I think one of the hopes with our film is of course to connect our film to the longer history of racism against Asian Americans, because there's been racism against Asian Americans for as long as Asian Americans have existed, as long as folks that look like us have been here, and people need to know that and realize that. But it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of flattening, because I think what it brings to mind for me is kind of a related idea, which would be solidarity, I guess, because I think, it wasn't long before Chol Soo was first arrested for the 1973 murder that the idea of Asian America was even just sort of invented, and it was meant to be a political identity, a pan-ethnic identity, and a way for people to find solidarity together. And, that's all well and good on paper, but I think what's kind of incredible about the Chol Soo Lee movement is that it was this early example of how that might work, of how you could get this sort of very disparate group of people from all these different countries with all these different immigration histories, politics, national identities. And what these folks did is they carved out the idea of what an Asian America could be. Which is engaged, which is together, which is powerful. And in this solidarity, which is really unlikely, nobody really expected folks to come together like this at the time, is what we were told. But what they found was not a flattening, but a recognition of difference, which is the opposite of flattening, but also common cause in this mission to free Chol Soo Lee. And so, it's really just this powerful example of, I think, what our communities could be, Asian American or not. And also, for our communities, I think it's just really just so powerful to see something that runs counter to these images of victimhood that I think we've all grown unfortunately so accustomed to seeing, to see these images of strength, images of connection and of solidarity and of people coming together and fighting together, these images of resistance, as something that can be an example for us and that folks can hopefully draw strength from today.
Thank you both so much for pointing that out. That really segues well into the next piece that I'd like for us to talk about together, which is really this like organizing. And New Jersey recently has become one of the very first states in the nation to require Asian American and Pacific Islander history be taught throughout the K through 12 public education system. And really this, at the Alliance, New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, one thing that we often reframe to ourselves is, let's not ask why I didn't know this, but let's ask who kept this information from us, right? Because exactly as you said, our communities have been organizing from the very moment that they arrived in what is now called America, right? Some of the earliest definitions of US citizenship were litigated against Asian Americans, right? To create an oppositional definition of white America and Asian America. And yet it's this history that, through no fault of our own, but through outright erasure that has been kept from us. But it can be very empowering when people do understand this history. And I was really struck when Jeff Adachi and Dave Kakashiba, they talk about how Asian American studies politicized them and brought them to Chol Soo Lee's story. And, as someone who, again, works in the immigrant justice world, I think there's often a perception that immigrants are very apolitical, right? That they sort of arrive here and don't have political identities. But truthfully, it's because our families were politicized at home that we often find ourselves here, and that our our mere existence here gets repoliticized again. I loved, the stories of the Defense Committee. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about just sort of digging out those stories. And I loved seeing pictures of people in their younger years and then the interviews of them in decades later. It was really beautiful to see. And both these now we would call them selfies, but pictures at crowded tea house tables, and then these Korean churches that were 20 rows deep and 50 seats across. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to unpack these organizing stories and these movement building stories?
Yeah, I think it was one of the best parts of working on this film, meeting, we had known KW Lee, the journalist, for quite a long time, but meeting these activists, having a chance to hear their stories and why they got involved in helping Chol Soo Lee. As you said, what's so amazing is this movement was started by Korean immigrants. It started with, Jae Kun Yoon and KW Lee and Grace Kim, middle-aged Korean immigrants who I think saw something of themselves in Chol Soo Lee, and I think helping him not only with something that demonstrated a social justice principle for them, but I think also they personalized his story so much they could connect with him, and there was something in him that they recognized in themselves. KW Lee himself, he told he said that meeting Chol Soo Lee sort of unlocked a latent Korean identity in him. He had worked as a mainstream newspaper reporter for decades, and this was the first story he did on a Korean immigrant, and actually he would go on to found some Korean American newspapers after that, because he wanted to focus on the stories of the Korean American community. But yeah, I think what's so surprising too about this movement is that they were able to mobilize other Korean immigrants. And like you said, they're sort of like maybe people you wouldn't identify or think are part of these types of very, bold and righteous social movements that you don't associate them with. And I think that's why we knew people had to see these images. They did have to see the Korean grandmothers in their traditional Korean dresses, at these protests at the courthouses. and, you know, asserting that this man is innocent, and that he needed to be freed. Because yeah, we don't think that that is even possible, perhaps, today. But it did happen, and you know, I think we shouldn't, you know, glamorize how difficult it must have been, though, right? I think to convince church congregations and people at community events to support this man who, you know, as we mentioned earlier, was no angel, you know, even before this wrongful conviction, and had a criminal record, and yet they were convinced that this was a wrong that they had to right. They were convinced that this poor Korean immigrant, who, you know, essentially was a street kid, was worthy of their time, attention, love, and care. You know, was worthy of a landmark movement, and that took, I think, a lot of hard work and imagination by these incredible activists. You know, both the Korean immigrants, and then joined by these young Asian American, you know, many of them in their 20s or college students, you know, who took up the cause, and also, I think, saw something of themselves in Chol Soo Lee, and the racism that, you know, he experienced, as well as, you know, feeling like our community is not seen, not heard, you know, not humanized, and fighting for him also became something, I think, that felt good for themselves to fight for. And I think that was always a touching part of our interviews too, like the fact that many of these activists, you know, point out that it felt good to fight for Chol Soo Lee, you know, that there's actually something quite rewarding about fighting for truth and justice, and for your fellow human being, you know, who is voiceless, and who didn't, you know, who needed their help. And so I think that's really important to point out too, that this activism is not just relegated to a certain demographic or a certain profile, you know. It's actually quite broad, and anyone actually can join such a movement, and that's what happened, you know, more than 40 years ago.
And I guess I'll just add that a lot of the archival material came from personal archives, and I think we've always felt that there's something quite significant about that. I mean, I think, you know, for any community like ours, you know, communities that have a history of marginalization, of exclusion, you know, that is reflected in the archives as well. You don't see faces like ours in the history, and that's part of that erasure that you're talking about. So we didn't know what we would find when we first started. We knew there was some material, but we weren't sure. And sort of KW Lee was really the linchpin. He started, I mean, first sharing his own personal archives that he had, which included so much material, just boxes and boxes of material, but included sort of these audio recordings of interviews that he had recorded with Chol Soo Lee while Chol Soo was in witness protection. KW also introduced us to people like Sandra Jin, who was a television reporter at the time and who makes a brief cameo in the film. She made a documentary about Chol Soo Lee in 1983. And she had material that she was willing to share with us. There was a generosity that I think really still just floors us today. And, you know, it wasn't long before we realized not only would there be enough to make a film, but something kind of more profound had happened. There was almost like, it was like we were glimpsing this underground archive, is what we've kind of come to call it, of material about Chol Soo Lee that had sprung up from the community. There was almost like this unspoken understanding among people that something of this moment had to be preserved, and many people had preserved material and they shared so much with us. And I think it goes to show, again, to come back to some of the themes you've mentioned, there's just such importance in the community being involved in its own archiving, in its own storytelling, and its own history preserving. And many of these people who shared these archives with us were Asian American, and if it was not for what they had done, I mean, we would not have a film today, we'd have nothing to share today. So we just owe a tremendous debt to them and to their trust of us. And it was, you know, part of what was so rewarding, I think, about that process was because it was a way to kind of enact intergenerational connection as well. And I think for Asian Americans in particular, I think for me, at least my Asian American existence, that's just something that's like been really, really profoundly moving to have been a part of.
Yeah, I really loved that you named that. I think we take for granted now being able to, like, hold down the button on your phone and take multiple shots at once. But especially, I know in my family, having immigrated around the same time, like the intention of taking, the decision to like use a shot of film on something and then like framing it and making sure the exposure and all of that, and to like spend the cost on developing a roll of film and keeping it over all of these years is an intention that I think we take for granted today. There's an audience question about how differently do you think this case would have played out today? Social media would have been a factor, but in your opinion, for better or for worse?
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting because if this happened today, I mean, sometimes I have thought about that. And well, number one, I would say this, like this case actually inspired a whole generation of Asian Americans who wanted to dedicate their lives and their careers towards social justice. And many of them actually became attorneys. They went to law school and became specifically, public defenders. Jeff Adachi, who's in our film, and unfortunately he has since passed, but he was the elected public defender for all of San Francisco. There's another activist in our film, Mike Suzuki. He's a public defender in Los Angeles. And so you do see there is a whole generation of people who are inspired by this case to try to make sure this doesn't happen again. And they wanted to work in their careers and their lives to try to prevent this. Even David Kakashiba, actually, he works at the East Bay Asian Youth Center, and he said he's trying to help the Chol Soo Lees who are children, when they're youth. But I think the challenge today is, I think especially for the Asian American community, we need to think about like, what are we going to spend our time on, which causes? And sometimes I do, worry, would somebody like a Chol Soo Lee, because of his criminal record, because of his profile, would that be something our community, would we take up his cause today? And of course, I would like to believe yes. But I think there's also sort of that open question to our community to challenge ourselves, because why, for example, why was this case not known for all these years? Why was the Chol Soo Lee case, which led to a landmark Asian American movement, not even, taught in Asian American studies classes in our colleges and universities? Why is there that omission? And, we suspect that might be because Chol Soo Lee was no angel. Because after he was released from prison, it was not a fairy tale ending. It got very messy, and he struggled and went back into criminality, had a drug addiction, and so the story got very messy. And sometimes we have to confront ourselves, our own Asian American community, and say, did it get too messy? Do we actually buy into our own model minority myth sometimes? And that's why this history was not something worth teaching in our history books. And so I think, to answer that, we don't know, but I think that's why we made this film. Kata Lee has said people without history are hollow, and we wanted people to fill themselves with this history, with the hope that once they know this history, they can arm themselves with it. They can see what Asian Americans did more than 40 years ago. The fact that they did devote their time and energies to a poor Korean immigrant, street kid, not some undergrad at Berkeley, who was wrongfully convicted. And I think that's just, that's a point worth emphasizing today. And, I think, yeah, we don't know the answer, but we just hope that our film can help, I think, inform people and have them ask themselves today, like, who are the Chol Soo Lees today, and what are each of our roles in trying to help that Chol Soo Lee, or what are each of our roles in creating a more just society for all?
Yeah, I think it's so important to name that, because even, outside of social media, just the way that our media narratives get built around, if you are a person of color, you must be 110% that perfect angel, right? And we see it time and again, especially when police kill young Black men, right? Well, we thought the bag of candy was a gun. Well, he was selling cigarettes out of the pack, right? He signed a check that he shouldn't have signed, right? And it justifies death and violence because they were not perfect. And so, of course, this is a consequence that we should expect, right? And I think there are a lot of learnings and like cross community and like organizing amongst communities of color that, we, by learning these histories and understanding these histories, can apply them to the things that we see today. And I think social media serves as both an amplifier, but I think often we get stuck in this like drain effect of just litigating narratives that end up like going nowhere. So I want to thank the audience for that question. Eugene, do you have anything to add? I know you were sharing a little bit about like the archival footage that you were going through. How do you think social media might add to a story like this today?
I mean, it's so difficult to say. I mean, because it's not just social media. I mean, this was a time before, as we were told, organizations like the Innocence Project existed. This was before DNA testing that can lead to exonerations. This was before many of the tools that we've grown accustomed to knowing about now are applied to cases like this. And this was also before, the rise of the carceral state as we know it today. And so I think one thing I just sort of find so dispiriting is so often these days you see people who are exonerated and the number of years they've done are just, it's just mind-boggling, and these are all just questions we need to ask about the society that we live in and that we sort of have like are a part of, and what we can do about that. I think, to come back to something Julie mentioned, the fact that Chelsea talked about being no angel, Michael Brown, whose death sort of sparked so much of the activism in Ferguson, was an early case to sort of that helped with the rise of BLM, was also referred to as no angel in the pages of the New York Times. And it speaks to that perfection that you're talking about, Amy, that particularly folks who are not white or who don't fit sort of like a certain narrative have to maintain to be able to seem like they deserve justice. But I think one of the things that like we hope people take from our film is that you shouldn't need to be a perfect person to deserve justice. This is something that we all have a right to. And so by being able to make that connection to what's happening today to back then, I mean, we see that it continues, but we also see that change is possible through just so much of the example that the activists set back then. And we hope that that's something that can help inform how people approach the situation today with all the tools that we have now.
Yes, it's so worth naming that even as unfair as the system was at that time, it's only gotten worse, right? It's only gotten worse in the decade since. And we haven't even talked about how, having been exonerated under the current immigration system, Chol Soo Lee would have been deported just because of his contact with the criminal legal system, regardless of, whether someone serves their sentence or just by having that interaction, it puts them on yet another pipeline, this one towards immigration detention and deportation.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, actually, because Ranko Yamada, when she's done panels with us, she's actually talked about some of those cases, kind of what's essentially the school to prison to deportation pipeline at this point, in cases of these days often Cambodian men kind of Cambodian people getting deported after having served time and after being released into parole, just getting transferred into ICE to ICE. And so, the Asian Prisoner Support Committee is an organization based in the Bay Area that does a lot of work around these questions and supporting these issues. We've been fortunate to partner with them to present some screenings of our film, and it's just been really meaningful, I think, to be able to connect our story to so much of what's happening today, because as you said, things, I don't want to say have gotten worse. Things are bad, but there are organizations like this now that are continuing the work that I think the activists in the Chol Soo Lee movement sort of started and set an example of. And I think there's a connection on that side as well.
Yeah, and I want to encourage folks who are New Jersey based to plug into some of the advocacy here at home. New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice is leading the fight for a privacy protection bill here in New Jersey called the Values Act that would prevent state agencies like the Department of Corrections from sharing information with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And there are lots of ways now where Chol Soo Lee's case would be even more tragic and complicated simply because of how unwieldy and unreined in both our criminal, legal, and immigration system have become. So there's lots of work to do in every corner of the nation, and especially here at home too.
No, I think, Amy, I don't know if it's just on my end, but Amy, I think your audio just went out
I'm sorry.
for a bit.
Oh, yeah, it's back now.
Can you hear me
Okay, it's
okay? Okay. We have a couple other audience questions, again, related to this idea about these systems, can they be reformed? If they're rooted in unfairness, how do we unroot that? One audience member asks, do you believe that having more diverse police forces, including investigators, a diverse jury, and diverse witnesses would have or could still make this something that can be prevented in the future? And then I'm going to just tag on another audience question. Feel free to answer them both at once. This audience member says, I'm concerned that the judicial system is becoming ever more politicized and partisan today. Do you feel that this will make things even worse for smaller communities that don't have the clout of larger and more powerful communities?
I think just on the first question, I think, of course, diversity, we need diversity in every segment of society, right? And so you see up in Chol Soo's life, that meant in the educational system that would have made a difference if there were a bilingual teacher, a bilingual counselor, social worker, after he immigrated. If there were, if there were not K.W. Lee, a Korean immigrant reporter working for a mainstream newspaper, then maybe Chol Soo Lee would have ended up, dying in prison. Definitely, I think diversity in our legal system as well, in all segments of society. Again, I think, I think it's a matter of, though, not only I think meaningful diversity in the sense that we also have to be be willing to challenge the way the systems operate, though, and so it's not only having more diverse newsrooms where you have more people of color represented as reporters and editors, but I think there's certain ways that I think certain systems work and operate, and they have done so traditionally. And then it's also a matter of, I think, challenging those systems, and trying to reform them to be more just and fair. I don't know if I can speak to the other issue, honestly, and feel like I'm doing it justice, to be honest. I don't know, Eugene, if you want to tackle it.
Sorry, I think this is my internet. Your audio went out for a second, Julie. One thing I just want to mention about diversity as well was that the jury for Chol Soo's retrial was more diverse, and that ended up having an effect, on the outcome. And K.W. Lee interviewed some of these jurors afterwards, and they spoke of how their experience as people of color made them understand how, folks of a certain group might look the same to folks who are not of that group, and how that everybody looking the same aspect of things could have led to Chol Soo getting railroaded in his original trial for the Chinatown murder. So there is that aspect, and it's just so funny how diversity is almost a shorthand for us kind of being able to see a person's humanity, you know, like it's almost like you need to sort of have that bridge over in order to be able to do that. But I think, you know, I'm not an activist, and so I can't, and I'm not a scholar, so I can't speak to sort of some of these questions as well as you probably could, Amy. I'm actually curious to hear what your thoughts on this might be. But I mean, I will say that one thing that really has taken me aback about the reception of the film was really just that question of connecting to Chol Soo Lee's personhood, him as a human being, to look past kind of his flaws and his mistakes and to see him for all that he was, which is something that, you know, I think as we were putting the film together, we weren't sure, like, would we be able to balance the inspirational aspects of the movement with sort of so much of the personal tragedies that he experienced. But what we've heard from audiences is that folks connect with him. And that's allowed them to see kind of some of the strength and the resilience and the charisma and just sort of how he could inspire a movement like this, as well as allow this movement, of course, to sort of be recognized and the amazing people who are behind it to be recognized. So I think as someone who's worked, you know, in media, as a journalist and in film, like the hope is that through storytelling like this, like people who have greater expertise, greater experience, greater awareness and greater connection will be able to sort of find strength in these stories as well, because I think there is tremendous value in being able to sort of know that this history is there and that this is possible.
Yeah, very, very great points. And I think it raises a question about how long are we willing to, you know, suffer the slow-handedness of reform at the cost of like other lives that then get sacrificed to the system. You know, more diverse officers did not prevent Tyree Nichols from being murdered at the hands of police in Memphis, right? And there are still many, many other ways in which it seems, you know, sometimes lawmakers can say, well, let's continue reforming this within our policing system or our prison and jail system, but are very slow to do things like reform juries to make them more diverse, right? Or like provide educational pathways so that people can go to college and become a defender and, you know, go to law school. So, you know, thinking about all of these, you know, when we're talking about reform, we need to be really taking a holistic approach and really thinking about, you know, are there systems that need to be reformed or are there systems that need to be rethought altogether?
Amy, I just wanted to riff off of that point because, you know, I think KW Lee is an interesting example. You know, there was a certain point where he had been covering the Chol Soo Lee story for his mainstream newspaper, and his editor finally said, you can't keep covering this story. You know, you have to work on you're our chief investigative reporter, you have to work on other stories. And he said, no, I'm going to see this story until the end, until he's released from prison. And that's when he actually left the paper and he started his own press. He started his own Korean American newspaper and completed the reporting and covered the case for the remaining years of that case. And he went on years later to found another Korean American newspaper. And actually, that's how I first met KW Lee and was inspired to become a journalist. But what I do remember KW Lee saying is that, you know what, at a certain point, we're tired of begging and cajoling and asking for changes and asking, you know, for our, you know, our stories to be heard and for us to get fair representation. And he said, we're just going to start our own presses. We're going to run our own presses. And I think, you know, that is my introduction to journalism, you know, about like, okay, you know, sometimes we need to just tell our own stories, found our own organizations, and be able to, you know, push forward that kind of truth and justice and representation and fairness and equality, on our own initiative. Do you know what I mean? And I think that ties into what Eugene was saying, earlier, just about, storytelling and the stories that we're telling about our own community, which is why we made this film.
That's so wonderful, Julie, because that actually brings me to one of the final questions, although I encourage audience members to rapidly type whatever you want in these closing remarks. In the Cumberland County short, Edgar Aquino-Huerta, who's an immigrant organizer, he says that farm workers have a lot of circles under our eyes, and it isn't from being tired, it's from the trapped tears that we've been unable to cry. And for you yourselves as Asian American storytellers, I think you've told us a lot over the course of today's Talkback how important it was to tell this story. And I think for me, watching it as an Asian American, there were many touching and resonant parts of the film, but I have to say one of my favorite Easter eggs was just the opening sequence of all of these old Chinatown photos and this like slow jam song playing in the background, and then all of these other like slow jam Motown hits that were kind of like threaded throughout the film. And I feel like for Asian Americans, whenever we're feeling like wistful or nostalgic, we like reach for those old like slow jam records, and just being able to see Asian American stories from Asian American creators is so special to me. Even as compelling as this story likely is for non-Asian American audiences. Can you tell people who want to get involved in the storytelling process, can you say a little bit about yourselves? What brought you to this work? How did that inform, how you came to this film? How does it lead to the work that you're doing today? I think you've said so much about the importance of owning and reclaiming our histories, being our own archivist and archaeologist of our histories. Any parting words for emerging storytellers who want to empower their communities through sharing their experiences?
It's funny because Eugene and I, the reason we met is because we both share a passion for telling our own community stories. We met through a magazine called Korean Journal, a national Korean American magazine, which has since folded. But we especially, I think, were attracted to complex Asian American stories, messy ones, and trying to do our best to tell them with nuance and depth, which is just something that I think has been sorely missing with stories about our community. And I think, in terms of advice, I think it's actually not easy, I think, maybe to make a living as a storyteller, honestly. And I think you have to really have that passion and conviction in you that you just absolutely have to do it. And that, you'll do whatever it takes so you can do this for a living. I think, as I mentioned earlier, K.W. Lee, he's my mentor, and he's the reason I was inspired to become a journalist. I met him when I was 18 years old. And I think to meet somebody who had this very incredible career as a mainstream news journalist, as an investigative reporter, somebody who covered the civil rights movement, as a Korean immigrant covering the civil rights movement in the South, and then was this investigative reporter who just dug so persistently for the truth in the Chol Soo Lee case, and helped inspire this landmark movement. I think when you meet somebody like that when you're so young, I think it changes your whole world. It changes your worldview. It changes how you view yourself and your role in this world. And I think I'll just, I don't feel like I have any great advice. So I'm just going to say, though, that I hope when people see this film and they meet a storyteller like K.W. Lee, incredible force of nature, I hope he inspires them. I hope he lights more fires of conscience. I hope he and the activists in our film, I think, inspire people to be like braver and bolder and more righteous than they think that they can be, you know, whether they want to pursue storytelling or something else, you know, something else risky. But yeah, I hope that they will take inspiration.
Yeah, I similarly don't know if I have great advice. I mean, I started off in a totally different career before shifting gears to storytelling, much to the chagrin of my parents. But I think, you know, I'll just reference back to something I was talking about before, just sort of this sense of intergenerational connection that I think, for me, I always felt was sort of missing as like a child of immigrants growing up, even in LA, which is so diverse. And so much of that has to do with, I mean, so many of the specifics of immigration and of displacement and of erasure. You know, we don't learn our histories, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have the language to be able to totally connect as people born here to sort of ancestral homelands and like the histories that might be there and that might inform us. So how do we find who we are? How do we know who we are here? And I think, you know, being able for me to connect to communities and to history is a way that's kind of filled that hole for me in terms of the sense of who I am and where I am and where we are. Like it connects to the perpetual foreigner myth as well, I think, which this idea that we don't really belong here, which I think is informed by a broad ignorance of who we are, even among our own community. And so to try and sort of do that, to address that, to build something so that, you know, my daughter and all of our children will not have to struggle with these same questions. They'll struggle with other questions, but it won't necessarily be this specific question. I think is just something that's become really important for me. And I think particularly for folks whose histories are not included, who come from groups that have been marginalized or excluded. I think that's something that has informed me, and certainly, and just to shout out the same person Julie mentioned, I mean, obviously folks like KW Lee, people need to know more about people like him. We have these folks in our history and in our communities, and the more that we learn about them, the more we feel, I'll just say the more I feel grounded and rooted and here.
Well, thank you both. And, you know, while maybe not everyone can make a living out of storytelling is always necessary and making a difference. So I really appreciate you both sharing your perspectives. In closing, how can audience members continue to follow your work? Is there a site to direct people to, a page that you'd like to share with audience members before we wrap?
Well, we'd love people also to, I know they just saw a 60-minute version of the film, but we'd love for you to watch the full film, which it'll be on PBS's Independent Lens, April 24th. That'll be our premiere, and then it'll be available on the PBS app, PBS YouTube, for 30 days, starting on the 24th. So please if you could share it, friends and family. We do think it's, you know, it's a very moving story and film, powerful film. And so if people could spread the word. Also, what, Chol Soo Lee PBS, hashtag Chol Soo Lee PBS, I believe. And also our website, FCSL-film, if you want information on all our screenings.
And we're also on Instagram. I mean, I think, yeah, a search will show what the sites are. And I forget whether this was mentioned, but I think just want to make sure that folks know that the version that will be on the app and on PBS YouTube has an option for Korean language subtitles. And so for folks who might need the Korean language subtitles to follow along, like if you all could just sort of spread that word as well, it would be greatly appreciated. And we're very grateful to Independent Lens and to PBS for allowing the support for us to be able to present that option.
Wonderful. And for folks interested in immigrant justice work, events, and things happening here in New Jersey, feel free to visit us at www.njimmigrantjustice.org or anywhere on social media under the hashtag NJ4All. Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you, Eugene. Wonderful to have a conversation with you both. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much, Amy.